Today's episode of the Great Deconstruction podcast is with a fella named Joe Quigley, who reached out to me from Mastodon, of all places. You can find me on Mastodon at revoxley.mastodon.lol. Joe's got an interesting story. I've really enjoyed seeing the way strings seem to be connected between the different people that we're going to be interviewing over this time and that I've already interviewed. I think Joe's an interesting guy. He was raised by missionary parents in Guatemala, who were also Wycliffe Bible Translators. Some people may be familiar with the ministry that they perform, and spent a good chunk of his life, most of his childhood, in Guatemala, among indigenous people and learning different cultures and being exposed in ways that a lot of us don't get to. So I think his story is really interesting, and his deconstruction is fairly recent, but as you'll hear, it's also something that's been going on for a while. So I hope that you enjoy this episode. There will be lots of links in the show notes to the books he recommends, to his own blogs, and to his Mastodon profile. If you're in the Fediverse, I think you'll find that Mastodon is pretty great, and he's got some good content on there. And you can follow me as well. But I hope you enjoyed this conversation. I think you'll find it interesting, and enjoy the hell out of it. I really enjoy talking to Joe. He's a smart guy. A lot of the same, as I said before, threads that really kind of link our stories together, and of those with people who will also be on the show later on. If you want to be on the show, feel free to reach out on my Substack, where you can find my email in the show notes as well. I'd love to have you, and I'll send you a little survey so I can get all the right information on you, know what to promote, know what to talk about, and enjoy the show. And as always, welcome to the Great Deconstruction. I am joined by Joseph Quigley, or Joe Quigley. Do you go by Joe or Joseph?
I go by whatever's easiest for you. Life's too short for Joseph sometimes, so I introduce myself as Joe, but I write it as Joseph.
Okay, cool. And let's see, you found, I think you came from Mastodon, is
Yes.
that right?
Mm-hmm.
Nice, very cool. I haven't used that platform a lot, but I really like it. And you can be found on Mastodon. Let's see, at Quigs, Quigs, at hackyderm.io. If you know what the Fediverse is, you'll be able to find that.
And if you don't know how to spell hachyderm, you can visit quigs.link, and I put some of my
Okay.
social stuff there because I think one of the downsides of leaving Twitter and Facebook and all these
Yeah.
other centralized areas is you don't have those simple, easy usernames to memorize.
Yeah, the simplicity's hurting.
Yep.
But I get way more interaction in with just a few followers than I ever did with over 1,000 followers on Twitter. It's strange.
Yeah, it really is.
But hey, I'm glad it exists. I think it's going to be a big competitor. So Joe here is a software engineering consultant who grew up in Latin America as a sheltered missionary kid. That's interesting. We'll get more into that. With Bible translator parents, baptized at age 6, myself as well. Went to a Christian college, got married, had kids, did everything right, then found himself rapidly and violently, that was a tough word, deconstructing over the course of 2 years after holding it back for over a decade. I know how that feels. And mine was violent as well and rapid and overwhelming,
Yeah, it's a good word.
for lack of a better term. The 2012 and 2016 elections laid the groundwork for 2020 when he realized that his faith community didn't share or uphold the values they taught him as a child. Yeah, that's certainly familiar as well. I think that has been the nexus for a lot of people who have begun deconstructing, and you can see kind of the trend
Yeah.
going upwards since that time, especially with COVID and being at home and not being able to go to a church where your ideas are constantly reinforced. After spending well over 500 hours listening to podcasts and reading books by evangelical and non-evangelical theologians, Christian scientists, and historians, he finally found the words and context to put his cognitive dissonance to rest. Very good. And I will go ahead and plug your blog first, and then we'll get into a conversation.
Sure.
You have an every so often publication for curious people who like learning about the connections between seemingly unconnected things. I'm going to be reading this a lot more. It's for the learn.blog. And a general purpose and tech focused blog is quigs.blog. That's Quigs.blog. And yeah, go ahead. And I want to know more about being raised by missionary parents. Where were you? What sort of work were they doing? What denomination, etc. Kind of give me some details, and take as long as you want.
Sure. So I am what is known as not only a missionary kid, but a third culture kid. I was born
Okay.
and raised in Guatemala. That's a country just south of Mexico. And it's kind of where Central America begins. Mexicans sort of think of themselves as being North Americans, and I don't know, there might be some geological reasons for why there's a cutoff, but Guatemala is kind of where Central America begins. I believe it ends in Panama. Um, and overall, if I were in polite company, I said uh, if I were in polite company, I would say that I had a very good childhood, an upbringing that was very adventurous, very unique. My parents were with Wycliffe Bible Translators,
Okay.
and in 1999, Wycliffe shut down. They had pretty much finished most of the translations in Guatemala. Guatemala has an indigenous population with 23 distinct languages. The national language is Spanish, so a lot of these people live in pretty remote areas, and so they, especially before the internet and mobile phones came around, they were largely unconnected to the world. So a lot of them didn't speak Spanish due to the influence of Catholicism. If you remember, if you know your church history, you'll know that up until I think 1972, Mass was conducted in Latin, and then there was this
Yeah.
kind of revival to clean things up a bit for the general populace, so they can better understand what's going on by changing, the liturgy to whatever the local language was. And I think that psychology kind of influenced itself in the evangelical world. Guatemala is sort of unique in Latin America in that it is a largely evangelical and religious country. So between Catholics and evangelicals, roughly 80 to 90% of the population is religious. And
Wow.
in the evangelical world in particular, in the indigenous evangelical world, um, there's this concept that the words of God, the Bible, um, is not it's not possible for it to be holy or true, perhaps one could say, if it is revealed in their language. Their language just is not good enough. Spanish is the language of God. And so my parents saw this as they were doing these Bible translations. And when Wycliffe said, "Hey, we're done with translating, we're leaving at the turn of the century," they decided to leave Wycliffe and become independent missionaries. And their primary focus was on scripture use. So all these translations are out, no one's using them, and they had very strong convictions about why that was. The Mayan culture in Guatemala is more of an oral culture. It's not much of a written culture. Even to this day, if you send someone a text message, you'll have a quality interaction. But face to face is 1,000 times better. If a picture is 1,000 words, in person conversation is worth a whole novel. So that was a pretty big influence in my life. Just nature of the environment that I was brought up in. My mother was raised Church of Christ. My dad was raised in the Christian Missionary Alliance. And their history with mission work is actually pretty similar. My dad did not become a born-again Christian until his 20s, because he knew deep down inside that the minute that he accepted Jesus into his heart, he would have to be a missionary. Christian Missionary Alliance, kind of their thing. My mom apparently, and I haven't talked to her too much about this. This has been sort of a one-sided conversation where my dad's retelling the family history, over breakfast or something like that. He likes to talk, and he says that she kind of wanted to be a missionary ever since she was a young girl. She went and got a degree in. She got 2 degrees, and I'm blanking on several of them. But she got her master's degree in linguistics, and she went to Abilene Christian University in Texas, which is coincidentally where I also attended college. And she needed those degrees as a woman in the 70s, 60s, and 70s to be considered a true missionary. My dad was not really an academic type, and so he landed in Guatemala with just an associate's degree. He barely snuck through the college in Pennsylvania New York, where he was getting his. Boy, I should know this. I don't remember what his degree was in either. Was very insistent that he cut his losses and walk away with the associates because he probably wouldn't make a bachelor's. And when he ended up joining Wycliffe, he didn't join as a Bible translator because they wanted more education. So he actually was a maintenance and mechanics guy. And so he and my mom met when he ended up fixing an appliance for her in her apartment. And she was always this, young, single, highly educated, very intelligent missionary woman in a fairly patriarchal and in some ways misogynistic culture. So their dynamic is quite interesting, just with how in the mission world you would think that the man is doing most of the work, but at least early on, before my parents had me and my sister, my mom was sort of the missionary breadwinner, if you will, the one who was doing the mission work. I mean, my dad was still serving as a missionary, but instead of people, it was appliances, cars, and the like.
Yeah. It's hard not to respect the missionary life for me, because you are transporting yourself to a place that's unfamiliar and
Yes.
a culture that you can't possibly understand without lots of time there.
Mm-hmm.
So you were raised in Guatemala?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Is that okay?
So I'm lucky
Right.
enough to be a dual citizen, which gives me very few benefits. It just means I get to join the shortest line in immigration when visiting either the U.S. or Guatemala.
Okay, that's interesting. Keep going. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no problem.
I saw you taking a drink. I wanted to ask you something. So go ahead.
So I'm trying to think back to your question a little bit earlier. That's kind of my family history and kind of what brought them to Guatemala. As I mentioned, the missionary life, or my upbringing, is fairly unique, and so while I do have plenty of criticisms of it, I'm also grateful for that experience, and kind of where it's placed me in my life. It's definitely a huge part of my story, my legacy, my heritage. But it's something that's often very difficult to explain to either monocultural people who've only lived in one country, and um, especially in the U.S., especially in the South, as I learned in Texas, uh, people don't even have a very good understanding of what cultures are like in neighboring
Right.
states. Lots
Yeah.
of people in the Deep South have no idea what it's like to live in the North, and there's different
Yeah.
cultural values between what we think is like one nation, the United States, but it's definitely um, we don't really have ethnic conflict in the ways that other countries do. Um, but there's still that cultural war conflict that just, and I'm not trying to be disparaging or anything like that, but it's just a natural result, I believe, of the intentional isolation that communities put upon themselves. It's very difficult and time consuming to uh, have that curious mind learn about people who are different from yourself when you never really interact with them all that much.
Would you say growing up in Guatemala, the people there were more interested in other cultures, or was it just a matter of we are exposed to other cultures, and so therefore?
Surprisingly, very similar to the U.S., just because
Okay.
of the remoteness and the isolation.
Yeah.
So, to give you a feel for how things were until roughly until I left for college, um, we, my life kind of revolved around two physical locations. Um, the capital city was where my parents did a lot of their banking. We would go to an English speaking non denominational church. Um, we would borrow books from the local Christian school there. So I was homeschooled. Um, the two methods of schooling at the time for missionary kids were the parents stay in one place, capital city, and send their kids to the Christian school. Sorry, there's three methods. That was one of them. That didn't work for my parents because they felt like they needed to be actively involved in the day in, day out business of mission work. But more importantly, that was necessary for them because the mission field, for lack of a better word, that we lived in was a 6 to 8 hour car journey. Since then, the paved roads and infrastructure improvements over the last 30 years have done wonders. It's far less of a taxing, time consuming trip. But at the time, because it took so long to get anywhere, to these small towns and villages where my parents worked, we would have to spend upwards of 6 to 8 weeks at times out in this isolated, backside of a mountain somewhere. That's now a thriving city, but at the time it was a very small town. And then we'd come back into the city to kind of recharge, refresh, resupply. We'd stay for
Yeah.
2 or 3 weeks and then head right back out again. So because of that isolation, the culture was also very unfamiliar with the local cultures were unfamiliar with what life is like, across a couple mountain ranges because it just took so long to get there. A lot of these people are subsistence farmers, so they don't have a lot of wealth or income to travel. They're kind of scraping by as best they can. The most exposure you would get is if they had enough money, they could send their kids to a boarding school in a city a couple hours away, and these kids would be exposed to big city life, and if they came back to the village where they grew up, they'd change some things a little bit, but not a whole lot. It definitely, things didn't start changing until cell phones and then the internet became prevalent, and then people could get connected and start to see the outside world. So having gone through that little rant about the US culture and just the diversity and the geographic distance and expanse. Even though Guatemala is roughly the size of the state of Ohio, culturally, with those 23
Uh,
different languages, people were very, very different. Um, Not like East versus West, kind of like if you pack up from New York City, or that's a poor example. If you pack up from like Raleigh, North Carolina, and you put yourself in Bangkok, Thailand, you'll get a little bit of culture shock. Not that drastic,
I
but it
I
is.
imagine. Yeah.
If you've ever visited New York City and then visited San Francisco, you'll feel that
Yeah.
huge difference in culture, even though everyone's still kind of all the same. It's like the weird
Yeah.
paradox in a way.
Yeah. Culture is. I consider myself a student of anthropology, and culture is
Mm-hmm.
kind of anthropology in its modern sense. Uh, so I've always found other cultures to be interesting and had a lot of respect for the fact that, I mean, the thing is, I come from white bread, very, very white people from England. There's nothing special, it feels, about where I come from. But if I hear other people's stories, I'm just like, wow, to be so, it makes me somewhat envious of these long histories that can often be told, and sometimes they're just verbally
Yeah.
given. But I never grew up with any of that. I didn't really know anything about my family or its history. Kind of had to figure that out on my own with ancestry.com. It's interesting that other cultures seem to care more about that than at least has been handed down to me. You said that you were baptized at the age of 6. Was that in your faith tradition? Would that have been because you were quote unquote saved? You followed the Romans road, and your convictions followed that, or was that more of a pressure from society?
Both, actually. So
Yeah.
just for contrast, my sister did not get baptized until she was in her teens. And interestingly enough, my wife, who did not grow up in a Church of Christ environment, even though we, excuse me, let me start over. And my wife, even though she did not grow up in a Church of Christ environment or background, although we both attended a Church of Christ university together, she didn't get baptized until her late teens. So I think just before she turned 20, or maybe after 20. My memory is a little fuzzy on that, but I actually baptized her personally. So
Oh,
it's there's a whole range there in my immediate connections. My mom, being a member of the Church of Christ her whole childhood, to her, baptism equated with salvation. I don't know if she fully believes
okay.
that anymore, um, but at the time, it definitely was a big deal. It's like you can confess that Jesus is your Lord and Savior, but it's not really cemented or true until you're baptized. For
Right.
me, there's home videos of me singing praise songs about worshiping Jesus and how awesome God is at like age 4 or 5, uh, maybe even 3, I believe. It goes way back, and um, we grew up in a fairly, from a religious perspective, a fairly authoritarian household. Um, Family devotionals were a very common nightly occurrence. It was nice to go visit friends and sleep over at their house because
Yeah.
I didn't have to do devotional. Um, Memorizing of scripture was very important. Um, and yeah, just that systemic social pressure, I guess, if you will, was what pushed me to become a baptized Christian at the age of 6. Not all my friends shared that. Wycliffe is a non-denominational organization, so it attracts people from all sort of faith backgrounds within the Christian circle. So most of my peers, my friends, didn't get baptized at age 6. That was definitely an anomaly. I remember one of my friends, they didn't attend our church, but they came for my baptism because that's a special thing. My dad baptized me, and after I got dried off and everything, I have a distinct memory of one of my friends asking me like, "So, do you feel any different?" And I thought for a minute, I'm like, no, I don't.
Yeah.
Just like getting dunked underwater. That was about it.
Just wetter.
Yeah, exactly. So I think in hindsight, part of my deconstruction, like I said, was kind of like a slow process for 10 years and then became violent. But like there are certain seeds that were planted really early on where I did not really. I bought into a lot of the thinking and behavior because that's the only thing that was modeled for me, but I still questioned or was uncomfortable with certain things, and I couldn't explain why because I had nothing to compare it to, and I had no one who had a different perspective who I could talk to about until I left for college and started meeting other people.
Interesting. Okay. And to kind of relate it to my own story, I was baptized at or around the age 6, but I had been quote unquote saved prior to that, and um, that was a big push. You had to do the process of accepting Jesus, and then you got baptized. But
Right.
it's really common for people around here. I'm in the state of Georgia, born and raised here. I really like this area. Um, really common for folks to be baptized really young,
Mm-hmm.
and then you know, every time you go to summer camp,
Yeah.
you do it again.
Yep.
You know, or anytime there's a big event, you end up doing it again because you got a good preacher that's kind of making you feel convicted. So you seems like I was probably baptized 3 or 4 times
Oh wow.
in total. Yeah, um, and 2 or 3 of those were at summer camp.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, that was, and I also grew up Pentecostal,
Oh okay.
so it was, you know, the evidence wasn't the baptism. The evidence was, do you speak in tongues? And there was a lot of social pressure around that. And I started doing that at a very young age, probably around 6 or 7. Um, and it was looking back, while I thought these are my convictions or whatever a 6-year-old would think about that.
Right.
Um, it was truly more of a pressure from that insular society that I was in. Uh, that's it's interesting to compare and contrast, and that's why
Yeah, it is.
I do that. So what was the thing that not really started your early deconstruction? Well, I guess I should ask you, you know, the 10-year period before the violence started. What were the things that were sticking, that were thorns in your side, I guess?
I have a pretty good memory, so I'm very sensitive to rejection.
Okay.
And so I have a very distinct and clear memory of whenever something uh, affects me in a negative way because I tried to do something and was turned down, or when I see that happen in other people. So I, I think the first inkling that something weird was going on was my camp counselor at Christian summer camp. Didn't get baptized multiple times. I only needed to do that once, but definitely felt that pressure to
Yeah.
recommit your life or reinvigorate your faith.
Yeah.
But my camp counselor, fantastic guy. He was very down to earth, um, very respectful. He was probably 19, maybe 20. Like the age range between me as the teenager and the camp counselor was pretty narrow at
Yeah.
times, because these were volunteers who'd come down from the States, basically short-term mission, work with missionary kids, and after that week and a half is up, fly back to the States, have a good experience, and hopefully done some good. It turned out that he was gay. He came out as gay at some point on Facebook, and the backlash to that, like, I'll never forget it, because I don't I I just don't have like a it's not that I've maybe repressed these memories or anything like that. It just I don't have any memories of anyone asking me about it. Like, there's everyone talking about him, but I wasn't involved, and he was, my counselor. I knew him, better than other people did, especially these parents who never interacted with him.
Right.
And so, if you ask my sister about this phase in our life, my parents told her to unfriend him on Facebook, because after the summer camp director flew from Guatemala up to the States to have this intervention with him, when he decided that he was not going to live according to the ways of the Bible, then he was kind of written off, and
Yeah.
ostracized. Um, and so as a result of that, all the kids at the summer camp were told to unfriend him on Facebook, cease contact. Before that, there was an inquiry into if he had molested anyone. But what's
Yeah.
weird, like, so he's a male counselor, and I am, a male summer camp attendee. I don't know what the camper, I guess, is the word. Um,
Yeah.
I don't have any memory of being asked if he molested me. Like, it's like I was completely glossed over. Maybe they thought he was targeting the younger kids. Like, just so bizarre. Like, if this is a big deal, why is no one asking me about it? They asked my sister if he
Right.
had done anything. I don't know how that's relevant to her being a female for a male
Right.
gay counselor,
Yeah.
but so there's this disconnect going on. And then furthermore, I've been raised to, you got to treat people with love the sinner, hate the sin. I don't think I was explicitly told, except maybe once or twice on a couple of Sundays at school groups, but not in my family. But it was just because this concept of, people are broken, we're patient with that, and we let God work on people. So on the one hand, it felt like there was this hypocrisy of we've got all these animistic Mayan indigenous people that we're trying to reach out to. They have really weird beliefs. We tolerate those. They may still sacrifice animals. We tolerate to these deities and spirits. We still tolerate that, hoping that they will eventually see the light and come to Jesus. But then this one American guy gets none of that. And I also remember distinctly thinking, like, if we ostracize, like, he's in my psychology at the time, he's definitely wrong. Being gay is wrong. But if we kick him out of fellowship and just ostracize him, he's not going to want to come back. There's no way he'll reconvert if he's not treated respectfully and fairly. Like, it's a mistake, but mistakes can be fixed, or so I thought. And that really kickstarted my questioning of, like, what's going on, because what the adults are doing and what they're saying aren't fully in agreement. And then in college, I became a little bit more involved or interested in apologetics. My grandfather on my mom's side was very big into that. My dad as well. And so we were basically a Ravi Zacharias International Ministries family. And I remember, in addition to that, definitely a lot of focus on the family stuff. There was the Truth Project. I don't remember the name of the guy, but this pseudo-intellectual takedown of secularism, particularly atheism, but secularism. Right. And this was several years after the gay counselor incident. And so we were starting to watch those whenever my grandparents would come down. It's like this 11 DVD series when my grandparents would come down for Christmas, and we'd watch that. And the
invigorating content, by the way.
It was very fascinating. Like, it stimulated me intellectually, but for the wrong reasons, I guess you could say, because these people are so convinced, and they have all the answers to evolution and secularism and logic, but it didn't quite add up to me. Like, there's a little bit too much intensity and vigor in these takedowns, and not enough listening of the other side of obviously these people, these atheists and non-Christians, are smart. They just don't know Jesus, but they're kind of being treated like idiots who are intentionally crafting things. Like, there's this concept of, like, everything's out there to get you as a Christian, and you gotta defend yourself.
I remember very specifically. So I was into apologetics a lot in high school, like a nutty amount, and even now I see it. Every claim that people like Ravi and those like him make are partial truths.
Yes.
So it'll be like, atheists believe that you evolved from nothing, and atheists believe that no. So it's and once you discover that, it's like, well, why are you being dishonest?
Right.
There's a dishonesty here, and why?
And putting so much.
I realized that myself.
And putting so much effort, or causing the listener to have to put so much effort into investigating the claims to find the half-truth, or the untrue part of the half-truth. It's almost like stochastic mind control or truth. I don't know what I'm trying to say here, but the amount of effort put in to say the untruth is far less work than it is to determine what is true. And that investigation, I think, over 10 years slowly, is what kind of kicked off my deconstruction once stuff got a little more intense in 2016 and 2020 in particular.
What was it about 2016? Was it Trump or
something else? TLDR Trump. I was still a very committed Christian at the time. Recently married. I've been married for 3 years by that time, 2.5 years, sorry, by that time. And a lot of very smart missionary people that I grew up with were very, confusingly so, very supportive of Trump, even though him as a character, like, the town drunk, the town philanderer, in these small communities where these Christians are working, they'll criticize them, they'll talk about them in a not disrespectful way per se. Like, in hindsight it was, but didn't feel that way at the time. They're given no free passes, but Trump was, because
Right.
why? Why is that? And that was the question I kept asking myself. Like, there's a reason for this. It wasn't until 2020 when I was able to put stuff in hindsight. I read Jonathan Haidt's "The Righteous Mind: Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion," and that really opened my eyes to this blending of politics and religion. And I was
Yeah.
largely isolated from that in Guatemala. It wasn't until college, the 2008 election, I didn't participate in, wasn't old enough. But the 2012 election, where I did not vote for Obama, um, it had this catastrophic feeling, like in the atmosphere, in the religious atmosphere, that the last 4 years had gone okay. Like, Obama hadn't taken
Right.
anyone's guns, he hadn't locked up any Christians, Islam
Right.
hadn't taken control of the government. Like, I don't know how much more he can do in the next in the next 4 years. And then you've got that political trend of, like, in the second term, usually the party in power loses control of one of or both of the houses. So, like, Obama's going to be handcuffed, or is going to have one hand behind his back. He's going to be severely handicapped politically until he's out. So why all the fuss about him winning again? And then to see that sort of replayed but opposite with Trump, where it's like, okay, now we've got the good guy who's kind of a bad guy if you believe in all the tenets of the Bible, and you follow the teachings of Paul and the things that he was upset about. And now we're supporting him politically, but not spiritually. But we're hoping, he says he's a Christian. Like, all it's just severe cognitive dissonance on all levels. Like,
Yeah.
I don't feel like there's much effort in trying to unpack that too much, because the short answer is, Christians in the States are very political. And many Christians who are nominally Christian are more active in politics than they are in their church. So if a guy says enough of the right things, like, since politics is slightly more important, like, that's where the energy and the focus and the outrage and everything is going to be. But I thought that my circle, the adults that I respected who raised me, would be a little more discerning, and they weren't. And that was the biggest trigger for me. Is it's like, yeah, Hillary's bad, this guy is not great, but we'll have to deal with it. And then over the next 4 years, there were just so many passes given to Trump that
Yeah.
it's like, well, Hillary's not around anymore. Why aren't we
Yeah.
being more critical? Why aren't we pushing back on some things that are clearly
Oddly enough, she
unchristian?
was not in prison as she was supposed to be,
Yes.
from what I understand. Anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah, that disturbed me and a lot of people, and it changed my respect for people that I did
Yes.
have respect for in a big way. Because if I had done any of the things that Trump was accused of, or that we know he did, people would have crucified me for it, because I am a publicly known, in my small town, everybody knows that Matt's the atheist. Matt's the one that's challenging the religious structure here. And the fact that this man merely said the words, "I'm a Christian and my favorite book is Thessalonica," is mind-blowing to me, because
Yeah.
in my opinion, I've still tried to eschew the values that I think are important within the Christian story. And so this man that never did ever at any point in his life was practically worshipped by many of my peers in this area. So I found that to be disturbing, though I had long been out of the faith in my deconstruction. About how old are you? It's really hard for me to tell.
No worries. I'm 31 right now.
Okay. So my deconstruction, I'm 37. My deconstruction started in like 2006.
Okay.
And it lasted for some time after that. I would actually probably 2004, right out of high school, and really hit that violent stage that we're going to come up to next.
Yeah.
In 2006. So tell me about what that looked like. What was the transition from, I'm questioning, to shit's falling apart?
So to any listeners here on the podcast, if you haven't heard the first episode of The Great Deconstruction with Lars Cade, I recommend that one. I listened to that and felt a surprisingly significant amount of camaraderie with Lars.
Yeah.
It was the overlap is pretty severe there.
Yeah.
And like him, like 2020 hit, and being shocked out of the church routine, the spiritual routine, in addition to all of the political and religious chaos of, Christians should wear masks to protect the vulnerable, but we don't want to because they're oppressive. Christians should stay
Yeah.
home and do Zoom church because, with the exception of, some elderly, pretty much everyone's got a mobile phone or computer and an internet connection, and we can make this work. This isn't going to last forever. But we can make this work. And they're just pushback of like, no, we got to be in church. Essentially, like, do the Christians believe the Bible because, like, the physical location of church is not what makes church church. That's not where God is present. It is the grouping, the union of two or more people gathered in His name.
Right.
The Bible doesn't say you have to be physically located, but you can gather online. You're still in community and camaraderie. It sucks. It's not as rewarding for most people as it is in person, but this is temporary. This too shall pass. And just this entitlement of, we have to do church in person. So are you Christians no different from Jews and Muslims, where you've got your holy cities and your holy sites where it's better to worship there than elsewhere? No, we're different. We're different. It's not lining up. And then factor on the political side of things, where, we've got the death of George Floyd, which is tragic, and somehow Christians seem to know everything going on there, and it's just it's just racism, or it's not kingdom work. But yet people are being oppressed. And then the government gets involved. And what disturbed me was the federal government's response to a lot of the protests. And I was starting conversations with my parents at this time. They weren't really religious in nature, just like, hey, this is weird. Like, you guys went through the 60s. That was a pretty tumultuous time. And if I do my math, they were slightly younger than I was in the 60s than I was during 2020. And that sounds like a horribly chaotic time, like a very, we didn't have all the answers. The media was controlled by the government during the Vietnam era. It's very hard to get, non-government sanctioned information out. And now we have people literally with cell phones disproving the government narrative about what's happening. And furthermore, the government's crackdown on mostly peaceful protests, like, when it turns not peaceful, it's usually the government instigating things. The federal troops, not necessarily the local police force, but it just. And then to hear, my parents sort of defend the misinformation that Trump was spouting off just because he's in front of a camera and wants to talk and doesn't really know what he's talking about. And his very authoritarian, I can't say the F word, but fascist, to them, but, his fascist-like responses to this stuff, it just didn't seem appropriate. And I learned that I don't line up with my parents' views politically at all on kind of how to employ the politics that you're interested in. And that kind of opened my eyes back to the religious side of things. Like, if they are okay with this much authoritarian response on the political sphere, what levels of authoritarian behavior are also acceptable in the spiritual and religious sphere? And I had been very depressed in 2019 because I had all the 10 years of buildup of cognitive dissonance stuff was taking a toll on me. And so at the time, there were a lot of churches that my wife and I didn't fit into. We had a highly sensitive kid at the time who just didn't like loud noises and loud groups. And so we attended a house church, and that house church was comprised of, on any given Sunday, about 12 to maximum of about 30 people. And a lot of them had a missionary background, or at least a cross-cultural experience, and it felt like home. But with the pandemic and us not being able to meet in person, we switched to Zoom for all the meetings. And in 2019, I learned that what filled me and gave me, spiritual energy was not the sermon and the worship. Like, I've never had a mystical spiritual high from music or sermons. So I've been always challenged intellectually, but summer camp, church, youth group revival, like other kids are just on fire. They're glowing, they're vibrating. Whatever word you want to use, and I'm feeling none of this. It's very confusing because I'm doing everything right according to the Bible, and I've got all the right beliefs. I've been baptized at 6. I'm not feeling this. And I learned, my mom's kind of the same way. It's just she's got an intellectual faith and she kind of keeps it that way. And that's okay. She's told me she's, fine with not feeling these things because she knows what she believes. And that's not what this faith is about. It's about that relationship with Jesus and, to a degree, the afterlife. But the coming out of that kind of depressive era in 2019, where I just did not like being in church, but I desperately needed that physical connection, because after this house church service, we did potluck every Sunday. That is where church was for me, was that community group where a lot of the conversations are still spiritual, religious in nature, but it's not the liturgy, it's not the the corny / canned songs, the slightly in depth but not really in depth talks about the Bible, because you gotta the pastor has to make his sermon approachable by everyone. And when that community got stripped away, that communal aspect got stripped away in 2020, I filled that time, that pressure, and that guilt of not being able to attend in person, with other things. And I learned pretty quickly on that I am way less anxious in hindsight. That's the right feeling. I'm way less anxious when I'm not in church with other Christians. And both my wife and I just were not really thriving in that church environment. And 2020, despite its difficulties from a spiritual perspective, was so freeing. It was so we recharged on so many levels by not having to put on our church face, I guess, for lack of a better word. I had doubts about Christianity, not in the sense of, I was a functional atheist in 2019, but I wouldn't accept that, I guess. And in 2020, with all this extra free time, because I wasn't socializing as much, I kind of reinvigorated my faith by dipping down into this intellectual wealth of knowledge that I had access to via podcasts and the internet. My mom, in fact, was the one who turned me on to a Old Testament Hebrew culture expert scholar named Dr. Michael Heiser. He runs a podcast called the Naked Bible Podcast. It's a fantastic podcast. I learned so much about the Bible from him. And kind of like the intro message, not sermon, but he gave a talk at some conference that really shook me. And this is what my mom sent me, was that he was explaining kind of like how the Old Testament was written and how the mindset of the ancient Hebrews and all that. And my parents are fundamentalists, but they're like light fundamentalists. My dad's a New Earth creationist. My mom, I don't quite know where she stands on that. My mom's very hard to get information out of. She's a very reserved person. In hindsight, as I've been discussing with my sister and learning more about trauma, she had a fairly traumatic childhood. And so she doesn't open up to people. I don't think she'd ever admit that per se with that word, but she's described, the few times she's described her childhood, once you understand the word trauma and kind of like how that plays out in your life, that word applies very well to the synonyms, I guess, that she used. So getting anything out of her is like pulling teeth. But one thing that I learned is that she's not really a biblical literist. Like, if you're a true Bible translator, you cannot be a literalist, because one, she's trained in Greek and Hebrew, so she knows the Bible better than most people. She's not a theologian, so she's not hypothesizing on the nature of God. She's like, this is what the Bible says, and we got to figure out how to interpret that or translate that into whatever language that we're translating the Bible to, and find words that work and concepts and imagery that works. And Michael Heiser really changed my faith life by essentially saying that the Old Testament is written in such a way that you're better off thinking of it as a mythology, because the ancient Hebrews knew that the sun didn't stand still. They knew that, 2 million Jews did not march out of Egypt. They
Yeah.
knew that, 100 people didn't kill on some random battle, 10,000 people with chariots and whatnot. But the culture at the time was this braggadocious, my God's better than your God. So they're like amping up their God, be like, look how cool he is, by just kind of like inflating the numbers. And if you look at the archaeological historical record, secular scientists support that. Like everyone just bragged all the time. Like that's how it was. Um, and I think due to, focus on the family and just other influences in my life, I was struggling with like, how do we treat the Bible as literal, but not really, because not even my dad truly believes that, but kinda. He's definitely, like I said, young Earth creationist. So, like, how do you carve up the Bible? All this is going on in 2020. How do you carve up the Bible into like what's true and what's mythology? And that was very taxing, both cognitively and emotionally. Um, and after investing several hundred hours into Michael Heiser's blog and podcasts and learning so much about the mentality of ancient Hebrews and the mentality of early Christians in the first and second centuries, and then stumbling across the Bible for Normal People podcast with Peter Enns and
It's a good one. Yeah.
I can't remember Jared's last name, but they came at the Bible from a very academic direction, just like Michael Heiser, but they tend to lean a little bit more liberal on both the political and the theological spectrum. And I kind of was in this turning point in my faith journey at the time where it's like, do I want to be a conservative Christian now that's been my faith's been reinvigorated, or a liberal one? And I pursued both. I mean, I kind of grew up on the conservative side, so I knew what that was like, but I pursued both, and they just felt lacking to me. And it
Yeah.
wasn't until I had read The Sin of Certainty by Pete Enns, where he kind of talks about his faith journey and, in a way, his deconstruction. He's still very much a committed Christian. But what he deconstructed from was this certainty of he has the answers, he knows what truth is. And I realized that my entire life, my faith journey, all the modeling by the adults in my life revolved around this certainty of like, we know the answer. If we don't know the answer, we know the answer's out there and it's kind of in this direction. And that just did not satisfy me, because every Muslim out there knows the answer. Every Sikh
Right.
knows the answer. Every Baptist, I didn't grow up in a Baptist household. They have weird beliefs apparently. They have the
It's
answer, but
also
they're also wrong. Like how can
it's
everyone have
also
the answer?
really common within Judaism to embrace that uncertainty, and
Yes.
that's one of the things that I learned that really opened my mind.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, yes, this is the word of God in the same way that you and I are created in the image of God, and it's our word. It's
Mm-hmm.
us trying to explain our own history and events that we cannot fathom to understand. That's what makes it important or special.
Yes.
Not that it is God breathed or anything
Right.
like that. And that sort of thing, that sort of, I guess, revelation that the Jews didn't believe in Satan in the same way, and
Mm-hmm.
the Jews have no concept of hell, and the Jews
Yeah.
have no concept of a literal heaven.
Mm-hmm.
That's that sort of thing kind of makes you stop and think, well, where did Christianity get all this?
Yeah.
What happened? And then you dive into church history, and
Mm-hmm.
Bob's your uncle.
Yes.
Everything just starts everything starts going off the rails. That's very interesting. It's like you were talking about the political religious marriage that
Mm-hmm.
that has been going on in the United States.
Which, if I can
Pretty
interrupt,
much,
I've learned
yeah,
that's been
yeah, yeah,
going on for the last 2,000 years. And
yeah.
not
It
just in
has, it
Christianity.
has.
That political religious connection is human. That's every religion,
Yeah.
every political culture has that.
What I struggle to understand is how I don't really struggle to understand it, but John Brown, who is one of my personal heroes, the abolitionists in the 1800s who raided Harper's Ferry
Mm-hmm.
and armed black men to be able to fight for their own freedom. is one of my heroes, and he was one of the most religious men of his day, a staunch Calvinist, a bit overbearing, and yet, as Calvinists can be, and yet he believed in the same book that was being used to justify slavery.
Yeah.
The same with Martin Luther King, who believed the same book as the guys who were in the KKK.
Mm-hmm.
So that contrast of what people can do with their belief in the Bible, or what they can do with Scripture as they want, and how it reflects you, is kind of a big eye opener, or it
Yeah.
was for me. And a last thing is Kristen Dumez. I don't know if you've read her book,
Yes,
Jesus
I
and John
did. I
Wayne.
love it.
Great book, and I think it kind of hits a lot of the same points as Heiser's book.
Yeah.
But this marriage, especially with American politics, is such a contrast from the Jesus that we see in the New Testament. So Jesus in the New Testament is telling you to separate yourself from the politics of your government,
Yes.
to not allow a man to have this much power and authority over you.
Mm-hmm.
Which is, if you spread that message, if you do it today here in America, I can guarantee you the same result. If you spread that message and tell people to sell all their property, and tell them to give unto Caesar what is Caesar's, except for they've sold everything, so there's nothing to give him.
Yeah.
That is the type of shit that gets you killed
Mm-hmm.
by the government. And it sounds like I'm trying to preach some libertarian message, but it's not. I actually think this whole Jesus message was government bad, community good. Real simple. And it's like the church of today does not see the Beatitudes. They're just missing from the Bible,
Yeah.
which is a totally different world than what you see in the Christian church today, or the Western church at the very least. Um, it, how that is being justified, how that is lost, I think is largely just because people believe the Bible is the true one word of God and don't know a goddamn thing about it.
Yeah. No,
So
I agree.
it's this belief followed by ignorance that is, I think, why Christianity will eventually fizzle itself out, or at least in the form that it is now, because it's kind of become this ludicrous concept.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I'll move on to my next question.
Sure.
What was the result? So you've deconstructed for 2 years. First, what was the mental process like? Was there anguish? Was there, uh, in my case, I say that my epistemological world flipped upside down, and I had to learn how to walk again. I had to learn how to understand life again. What was that like, and what was the result? What is the product of that?
Yeah. I wouldn't use such fancy words because I haven't memorized them all, but pretty much exactly what you said. I had to rethink everything about life and my beliefs, because I realized that my faith was not my own. It had been built for me by those who came before me. And growing up in an isolated environment, both intellectually and physically, I had nothing to compare what was this truth from on high, whether it was from the Bible or what someone said about the Bible. And I just had to unpack so much. A key thing for me was the question of hell, and the afterlife. There's some fantastic books on that if some of your listeners would like to get into. There's the Evangelical Universalist by Gregory. I can give you some of this in the show notes because I don't remember off the top of my head. But
Okay.
Evangelical Universalist, and then there was another one on universal salvation from a more intellectual side of things. Um, and so I kind of read things from both sides, if you will, like highly academic and sort of like for lay people, by committed Christians who thought that the Bible supported universal salvation, and that helped a lot. The other thing that kind of helped me was my dad. When I was discussing some of these things with him, my dad told me that he didn't believe in eternal torment and suffering and in hell, as is classically known. because the Bible doesn't support it. It doesn't talk about that. It talks about, the lake of fire, where there's, gnashing of teeth and all of that. But my dad essentially is an annihilationist. Like, if you don't believe in Jesus by the time you die, and then there's that final judgment where he thinks there might be a chance you could change your mind once you're thrown into that, lake of, not the lake of fire, but the destruction in Revelation. My dad's a big Revelation guy. He loves end times. It's his favorite book. He's invested so much time and study into that book. He really knows what he's talking about. I just don't buy it as a authoritative source anymore. But I realized that I was okay with either outcome. If by not believing in Jesus and in the Bible, however you want to phrase that, I just poof out of existence, that doesn't sound all that bad. Especially as a kid, singing to Jesus 24/7 for all eternity didn't sound like that much fun either. So, like, you win some, you lose some, but then some of these other authors were arguing for universal salvation, where maybe hell, they're not saying this one way or another, they're just hypothesizing maybe hell is more like purgatory, where you need the time to figure out, to experience God's love that you didn't before. So that didn't sound too bad. Then I invested a lot of time into LGBT affirmation, some of the purity concepts, especially after reading Jonathan Haidt's book. Like, purity is largely a cultural invention. All of the religion's sacred texts base their concept of what's pure and impure less so on what God thinks and more of their cultural context. So people are building their faith since the beginning on kind of what they see around them. And it just clicked with me that I don't have to believe any of this. Like, I tried to build up my faith between 2020 and January of 2022, to be honest. And the more I dug, the more it started to fall apart under its own weight, and not through my own misconceptions or preconceptions, but just, it seems like people want to believe what they want to believe. And the missionary system, the evangelical industrial complex, for lack of a better word, that we have here, and my own experiences with, again, these committed Christians who say everything's important and then don't really live it out, especially in their political lives. They pick and choose their faith more than they're willing to admit. And if I have to do that, because I had never done that before, I just inherited my faith from my environment. I realized that I didn't want to have that faith. I pretty quickly in 2020, came out to my parents as like, I'm not going to call myself a Christian because the Christians that I see outside don't line up with my values and they don't line up with the Bible. And they kind of, my dad's like, yeah, I haven't really called myself a Christian for years now. But in 2022, there came a point where, deep down inside, I knew that I didn't believe anything in the Bible that I had been taught. I still believe that the Bible is a good wisdom literature. I still believe that of all the religions out there, Christianity has the highest potential to be the correct one. But I also don't see the point, again, from that Sin of Certainty book, in identifying what is the correct religion or the correct belief. Because there really is no correct. Everyone has their own version, so how can there be one correct one? And I'm not just talking about, like, Muslim versus Christian or Judaism versus Christian. Like, within the Christian denominations, wars have been fought over, literal people killing each other over some of these very minor sounding beliefs. And since the system hasn't benefited me, I don't really want to participate anymore. And that weighed on me so heavily, because that meant that I could not only not call myself a Christian, but I couldn't really consider myself a theist anymore. I came out to my parents as agnostic and some of my close friends as agnostic in the middle of 2022, and I was only able to do that after intense therapy, because just that psychological weight, that upbringing, that system, that it's better to be gay than it is to be a non-believer in the system that I've grown up in. That I just, it just completely wrecked me for almost a month straight. Like it was difficult getting out of bed. It was impossible to just feel any peace because I just wrestling like how do I line these things up? And once I finally admitted to myself, when I came up to myself that I am an agnostic, although I think I would classify myself as an agnostic atheist, I I felt I felt born again. I don't know how to
Oh
put
yeah,
it. That
I know the feeling.
salvation
Yeah, yeah,
story that we hear, where like my life was terrible and then I accepted Jesus and everything became okay. If you can perversely invert that, that was my experience.
yeah.
That
100% the same.
peace that I felt and joy and the ability to meet other people where they were at without having to be so defensive. Like, are these people in truth? Whether that's, are they a different religion or are
Right.
they saying the right things about the Bible? Um, it just completely changed my world. And the stepping stones for that process had been laid, like I said, over the last 10 years before that. I stumbled into a lot of um, intellectual or philosophical podcasts, particularly the Tim Ferriss podcast, where you've got these deep thinkers who talk about the meaning of life. And, Gabor Mate had a lot of really interesting uh, interviews with him. I think he's been on there 2 or 3 times talking about the nature of suffering and addiction and why people are in pain, and so like the psychological prospect concepts of growing up, I guess for lack of a better word, um, outside of the Christian mindset, I could still see that people had meaning in their lives. I could see that they had joy and that they had peace, all these exclusive promises that are only allowed to Christians, non-Christians are experiencing. And as after attending college and leaving leaving that sheltered lifestyle as a missionary kid, I met more non-theistic people who were good people who had a stronger sense of morality than some of the Christians I eventually discovered would. Like, it just felt like I've been lied to my whole life. Not that the
Right.
Bible isn't true, but how to apply the Bible as a Christian, I'd been lied to my whole life. And pair that up with studying the Bible really deeply by especially the conservative evangelical scholars like Michael Heiser, I learned that it's not so black and white. It's not so cut and dry. You really have to build your own faith. And I just never really had it, I think.
Yeah.
Um, I thought I did. I believed in all this stuff, but I never got that reciprocal. I don't know. I'm making a great argument for Calvinism, I think, here in the sense that
I call
God didn't
myself.
choose me, so of course I wouldn't feel it. Um,
I frequently call myself a Calvinist atheist,
mhm.
because I tell people that if faith is a gift from God, it's a gift that I don't have,
Yeah,
and
I
that's
like
not
that.
on me.
Yeah.
It's not something I can change or choose. And if I could, I probably would have chosen to
Mhm.
stay in the faith. That's a pretty common thread among people
Yes.
who are in the faith. It's like, I can't make this happen any different. Like I can't forget how to ride a bicycle.
Mhm.
I can't also immediately know how if I don't know how. It's like it's either you can or you can, or you're convinced of what you're convinced of, and that's
Yeah,
all you can do about it.
but I think more specifically to maybe flesh out a little bit about your question, I I think I experienced the biggest struggle that I had leading up to that, and still slightly after, is that sense of loss, that sense of community and identity. And
Yeah,
like I felt like I had withdrawn myself naturally from the community, but like actually admitting it to myself and then eventually to some friends and some family really finalized it. And there's just so much intense like clinically complicated grief in that process. Like I don't recommend it. Like if you're happy to stay in your faith even if it sucks, that will be easier for you. But for me it was not there was no question. Like I was miserable
yeah,
until I admitted that I don't actually believe this. And in some ways I feel like that has made my faith, if you can call it that, stronger, because ultimately I believe that it will all be okay. Like if God is
yeah,
real and does exist, if the Bible is true and that God is love and he understands us, we're made in his image, like this is just a natural process. And it's not that I expect to be,
yeah,
come back to the faith anytime soon. I'm also not resistant to that. I just don't think it's likely because Christianity hasn't changed in the last 2,000 years. So I don't know what will cause that to change in the next 20 or 30. But, ultimately I choose to believe that God is a good guy. I don't buy into the brimstone and hellfire and genocide versions of God. I think that's largely humans projecting their nature onto their God and making him sound cooler than the other gods who did that at the time. So the downside's pretty minimal for me, from like a epistemological afterlife concept. But the changes in my life here now have been night and day. It's been very freeing to be able to just love people and not have to worry about converting them like that. That's kind of like low key, always there. And not converting them maybe to Jesus, but converting them to the truth, the right answer. As you can tell with like interdenominational conflict, like you're always in a defensive, anxious state in Christianity. And I've lived that long enough, and I choose not to participate in that, which currently means I've lost all that community. And that was extremely difficult.
Is your wife was a Christian when you guys were married? Is she still there, or do you kind of go through this in the same step?
We tend to leapfrog each other on some of these things. She's the same age as me, so I think developmentally we're very on track, emotionally and cognitively. So this journey has been different for her. I'd rather let her kind of explain that in her own terms.
Yeah.
But we're very much on the same page.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know if she would consider herself agnostic or an atheist, but she also wouldn't consider herself a Christian in the classical sense that she and I were both raised up in.
Yeah. That's that can be the end of a marriage or the end
Yes.
of a relationship at times, and I've seen that. But I've also seen it be the crux of how people come together and learn to love each other more and learn patience. And so it's I asked that not to be nosy, but you were married, and it's a trial to go through deconstruction and be married at the same time.
Yes.
Especially in some situations. I have a friend who was a deacon elder at his church, and he told his wife he didn't believe, and the way that his life fell apart was just out of this world. I mean, the church was just after him, and it was a more culty type church than most, but it's frightening what can happen in those situations. But I think today versus back whenever I went through it, today people are a little more capable of handling.
Yeah, it seems that way.
The questioner in their life, the doubter. I'll ask one more thing, and I'll let you go. And you kind of already hit on this with your parents and their somewhat fundamentalism, though your father's kind of left a lot of that behind. It sounds like. What is your dynamic like with them? Do they understand this or resent you or anything like that going on?
I legitimately can't answer that question. In the family history, my uncle also left the faith, my mom's brother, and my grandparents came from a Catholic and Episcopal background before they essentially converted to Church of Christ. And I've talked to him about his deconversion coming out process. He and my mom still fairly reserved, and so it's been difficult to get some of the information I want out of it, but he's been pretty open about it. And he mentioned that there was some stress or conflict or isolation, and then eventually that disappeared. And I've talked to another friend of mine who has missionary parents, and he came out as atheistic to them about a decade ago and talked about that struggle of disconnect. And within the last 4 years, he said, hey, they've shown an interest in the relationship again. And one of the biggest emotional struggles for me that therapy helped me with was processing how my parents would handle coming out to them, because I couldn't keep it a secret from them. It's one of those things that just had to come out. And my worst fear in telling them was not that I'd be rejected, not that I'd be accepted, but that nothing would happen. And that is exactly what happened. I called him up
Gotcha.
one day and said, hey, I've been wrestling with this for a long time. I want to let you guys know that, as you know, I don't really consider myself a Christian, but I think I would consider myself agnostic. I'm tired of having to seek all the right answers. And I tried my hardest not to justify it and just say, this is where I'm at. And I said, if you want to talk about it in the future, I'm open to it. I don't want to talk about it right now on this call. But that's where I am. And my dad was very receptive towards that. He said, I'm not happy that I'm not happy to hear this, but I'm happy that you told us. And my mom, as I was talking through this, just formed this 1,000-yard stare and never said anything for the rest of the call. And that was in August, I think, last year. So it's been 6 months.
Wow.
Very recently, yeah. It's been 6 months. And it's that conversation topic's never come up again. It's not come up when we've met in person. It's not come up when I call him on the phone. I just had them here last week. They were with us for about a week, and we had a great time. But that just never was a thing.
Wow. That's interesting. My mom, it's kind of funny. Growing up, my mom was a partier, um, a bit of a heathen, really a hedonist. She really sought her own pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
And I was a religious little kid who thought, oh my God, my mom's going to hell.
Oh, man.
To hell. It was torture for me.
Yeah,
and,
I can imagine.
As soon as I spoke the word out loud and wrote the first blog that explained this experience and what I had gone through and declared myself as a non-believer, she did a flip, and it's like she became on fire, 100% gospel holy roller. And that change has been a hard one to navigate for us, and especially now I have a trans partner that is a tough point for her. So there's all kinds of things, but also, I've learned to have conversations with her about, hey, all the shit you were doing when I was younger, that had an impact on me.
Mm-hmm.
You made decisions that were bad for me and my siblings. So there has also been some healing because of some very frank conversations.
Good.
And I suspect, and I can't possibly predict, but I suspect that your parents will find a way to communicate about this civilly.
Yeah.
My mom and I do somehow, and it works now. But it did take quite a few years before we could actually approach it.
Mm-hmm.
But that required me to be brutally honest about some things.
Yeah.
And to also say, for me to say, this is a time for you to listen and try to understand some
Mm-hmm. things,
and her to receive that. But I hope that does get better. It is still fresh, so
yeah,
don't expect it to stay that way forever. In my experience, it doesn't stay that way forever. And you don't sound like a combative person. You don't have any of that in you, so that
I
will make
am.
it all the much easier. Are you really?
There's some history between us on that area.
Okay.
It's largely on the political sphere. Like I said some of that stuff from 2020. So I think my mom's always said she was afraid of me, my intellect, ever since I was a little kid.
I got that a lot too. Yeah.
And my dad just cognitively processes things slower than my mom does. So like talking to them both at the same time is difficult just because you have to move at different speeds. So yeah, ultimately I'm hopeful that we'll have some productive conversations, but there's also a good chance we might not. Like my uncle kind of set the tone for, I guess, effective conversation. Like I don't quite know how he's done it, but my whole life, part of the reason why it was so difficult to come out to them is I've heard how they talked about him my whole life. As this mistaken guy who's stubborn, who won't see the truth and won't sit down and have a discussion. And I've learned, having had discussions with my uncle, that he's a great discussor. He discusses things well. But like what you were touching on, the discussion, both parties have to be in a position where they're willing to be curious and learn from the other person. And even if you don't believe what the other person says, you still have to accept that they believe what they say. And again, my parents left the United States in their late 20s and early 30s, and they've been in Guatemala ever since. So they are almost as Guatemalan as they are American, and well, more so in some ways, just because they've spent the majority of their life there. And they went at a time when there was no internet, there was limited connection. So their version of the States is, in some ways, this hybrid mix between 1980s America and then social media infested 2010s plus USA. And that blending has left them somewhat sheltered in their own way. And just the nature of the mission field, working with other missionaries, like they don't really interact with non-Christians who aren't the recipients of their mission work. And so there's a lot that they just don't have practice or experience with. And that makes conversation hard because they don't have that innate curiosity because they don't know what's out there in a way. Like, again, they're they're old adults. They know. Now, I don't mean that derogatorily, but they have life experience, but not in this area to the degree that they do. And they have a family history on both sides of their family with resistant family members who don't want to convert. So I can't imagine what they're going through emotionally. I definitely sympathize with them. And I just hope that eventually, like you said, like, and one of my other friends said, is eventually the conversations will happen. And I'm just not going to try and push it and rush it. It's got to be on their own time.
Yeah, I think it's also a good idea to take those conversations one bit at a time. You don't have to get it all out in the same day. You know, it can be, let's talk about why, let's talk about the things that happened when I was a child, and let's talk about why my doubts started there. And then would finish that conversation and then have another one later. And you don't have to get it all out of the same day. My mom is really guilty of saying, just tell me what happened. Just tell me. And I'm like,
you got 5 hours?
It's too much. It's a lot. It's so much. So, and her thing with me, she's always said that I studied the Bible too much, and that's why I became an atheist. That's why I was so fundamentalist. And so for her, it was that intellectual pursuit that was somehow also scary. The fact that I loved God kind of scared her, and she thinks ultimately ended up in the result that she has is this godless heathen of a son. But our relationship's better than it has been in many years, and I went through a very traumatic childhood, which is why I became so religious ultimately, is because I needed a dependable, loving father to dote on me, I guess. And I sought that in religious faith and in trying to prove myself to God. And I think she understands stuff like that now, and has kind of come around to the fact that it was her doing, and the people she allowed in her life that actually put me here, and into where I was. That's why I became so religious in the first place. Well, Joe, I this has been a great conversation. I think this might be one we could continue at some point.
Sure, I'd be happy to.
I think it was really good. You're great on the microphone. You sound good, and you know how to lead your own discussion, really. So
thank you.
I would love to have you again, and I hope you'll send me some links to various resources you'd like to share.
Sure.
So I can put it in the show notes. I won't take any more of your time. I appreciate you coming on, and it'll probably be a few weeks before I actually publish this, but fantastic. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I did too. You're a great
and I'll let
interviewer.
you, if you have any final words you'd like to say, I'll let you say them now, and then I'll end the call.
Not really, no. You know where to find me, quigs.link, and just be gentle on yourself and gentle those around you, because like you just described with your mom, that had to be a difficult process too. We don't know what it's like to be in other people's shoes, and so a little grace and patience is required from everyone.
Yeah, I think grace is everything. I think you said a lot there, and we can even support that idea with the Bible. So
yes,
everybody should be happy with that. With that as a final word.
Yeah,
that showing grace will get you pretty far in life.
Indeed.
All right. Well, let me stop it real quick.